Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this second live meetup for Hack to the Future. This is one of a series that we are running for our global fintech hackathon, Hack to the Future, that was just launched. And this hackathon is aimed to redefine finance for good. For more information, please check fintech.devpost.com. And for today's session, I'm really excited and honored to have with us today Camille Morvan. Camille is PhD in neuroscience. She's a global specialist in the neuroscience of decision making and cognitive biases. A very impressive CV. She has conducted her research notably at New York University and Harvard University, and she's also the co-founder and co-CEO of Goshaba, which is a startup aimed to remove bias from the recruiting process.
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you, Shirin, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here, and welcome everyone who's joining us.
Thank you. So in today's session, we'll focus on cognitive and technology or algorithmic biases and how to avoid both in order to build inclusive technology. But before we get there, Camille, can you please tell us a bit more about you, your background, and what brought you to work on inclusion?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Shirin. So my background, as you said, is in neuroscience. So I have a PhD in neuroscience, and then I worked in Japan. I worked in the States, New York University and Harvard, as you said. In my research, I was working on cognitive bias and decision making, and particularly trying to differentiate when decisions are made explicitly or implicitly. When we make implicit decisions, the problem actually for implicit and explicit decisions, the problem we can have is that biases will influence our decisions, right? So we know a lot of biases like first impression bias is something where you see someone and you define your whole impression of the person based on the first 3 seconds that you've seen that person. There's lots of biases that will cloud our judgment. And in my research, I worked on where biases help us take better decisions and where biases actually impair our decision making and make it worse. So that's what I was doing as a researcher. In order to study that, I was developing cognitive tests. So it's like little boring video games that people would come in the lab and take, and that would measure their cognitive traits, right? So are you someone who's impulsive? Do you have a good memory? Can you read other people's emotions easily? So this is the kind of things I was studying in the lab. And when I was at Harvard, I worked also as a recruiter, as a headhunter. And that's when I realized that recruiting decisions are made very poorly today because most of the time recruiters are going to base their judgment on resumes or LinkedIn profiles, which gives a lot of space for biases and first impression, like all sorts of biases, because the problem with the resume is that the data in the resume and LinkedIn profile is inaccurate, imprecise, and sometimes plain false because people can say whatever they want. So when you judge a candidate based on the resume or the LinkedIn profile, you end up basically picking the person who's the best at selling themselves rather than the person who's the best for the job. So I observed that, and I thought we could do better using the technique that I developed in the lab. So in 2014, I came back to France to start Goshaba. And since then, I'm the CEO and the co-founder of this company.
Yeah, thank you. Can you tell us a bit more about Goshaba and what you do there?
Yeah, so Goshaba is a technology that, so we use cognitive science to evaluate candidates' soft skills, and not only soft skills, also hard skills and the culture fit. So the way it works is if you're a candidate for a company, for instance, McDonald's, we work with McDonald's today, you will apply to the job by taking a series of Goshaba games that will evaluate the traits that are necessary for you to be successful in the job. So for instance, when we evaluate people who work in restaurants, we will measure their capacity to go from one task to the other, because when you work in a McDonald's restaurant, you have to change tasks all the time. We also do the recruiting for Accenture, and in this case, the series of games we use to evaluate the skills are different because when you work as a consultant, you need different skills than when you work in a McDonald's restaurant. So Goshaba provides companies with the right sequence of cognitive games that would evaluate soft skills and hard skills. Then recruiters have an objective score of candidates matching with job, and they can base their recruiting decisions on that rather than basing it on the resume. They can base it on this Goshaba score that's actually objective. And the what matters to us is to make recruiting fair. So with Goshaba, we can reveal candidates' potential regardless of where they went to school, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their religion, regardless of their gender, their potential handicap, or any other discriminating factors that have nothing to do in recruiting. So Goshaba makes recruiting more diverse. We give the chance to people to get great jobs that they would not get otherwise. And in the meantime, we make recruiting really fun because the candidates will actually play games to be recruited rather than having to write a resume and a cover letter. So we make recruiting fair, but also fun.
And if I understand it correctly, you're removing the resume and the cover letter completely out of the recruiting process. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So our goal, our dream, is to create a world where people can really reveal themselves and reveal their potential at work. And the step, because we spend a lot of time at work, and it's really important that we can all give the best we can in a job that fits our need, that fits our skills. So the first step to that vision is to make sure that when you are evaluated for a job, you're evaluated on the right skills, on the right element, right, of your personality. So today, some companies that are very, I guess, future looking, who are very innovative, they work with us and they completely replace the resume by Goshaba. That's what we hope to do most of the time. Some companies can take it a little bit more slowly, and in that case, they use Goshaba and they still use the resume. Sometimes it can be understandable because you may want to make sure that people come from a good school or any other factor that can become important. But the idea is that we're replacing the resume, or we hope to replace the resume entirely and make it disappear.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And how do you measure really how effective the use of Goshaba is on making recruitment more fair in terms of gender balance and ethnic origins, etc.?
So that's a really good question. In France, we can't do any ethnic statistics, which are legal, for instance, in the States. So the way we measure diversity is first we measure gender, because that's something that we can recover from the name, or we can even ask candidates. Then the other diversity that we care about is not necessarily. Often what happens is that there is a link between social diversity or social background and ethnic diversity, right? Because unfortunately in most countries, and that's certainly the case in France, the representation of non-whites in populations that are more poor is higher. So one way for us to make sure that we increase diversity is by having people who come from regions of France that are less privileged. We measure also the type of schools that candidates who are selected went to, right? So if I give the example of Accenture, they used to have a set of, I believe, 50 schools, and they would only pick candidates from these 50 schools. Now with Goshaba, they don't look at the school as a first instance. They just pick the best candidates. And then a posteriori, once the people have been recruited, they look at what school they went to. And they realize that doing that, they actually opened up recruiting to universities that are not very well ranked. But it just so happens that some people in this university are really good. So for instance, with Accenture, we have, in terms of gender, we're increasing the percentage of women getting traditionally main job like engineers. So we have a perfect gender balance in the type of candidates that we send them. We also have examples of candidates who told us they would not have applied at Accenture because they thought that they didn't have the profile because they come from less privileged areas. And they said because of the Goshaba application, they knew their name or their address would not be revealed. So they took a chance and they got hired. And it's interesting because Accenture is actually a company that tries to have a lot of diversity, but somehow it's not necessarily the image candidates have. So having Goshaba as the entry gate allows some candidates to get a job there and be happier, but it also allows Accenture in the pursuit of their diversity goals. So we measure gender diversity, we measure origins, we measure schools, and then we measure candidate satisfaction and recruiter satisfaction. So today we have a 90% precision when we hire someone. What it means is that if you invite 10 people to an interview and they've been selected by Goshaba, you know that 9 out of 10 have the skills for that job, right? And then the only thing you will check is whether these people will be a good fit for your team. When that selection is made based on the resume, the precision is only 20%, which means that you have 2 people that you're invited for interview that have the skills and 8 that don't have it. So we're bumping that statistic really high.
Oh, that's amazing. That's really cool. Now, just to take you and to take all of our audience as well back to the hackathon, Hack to the Future, which is more focused on the fintech space. Do you see any similarities between this recruiting process, the biases that can be there, the lack of diversity that we can find sometimes with the challenges that we have in the financial world?
So I know better the recruiting world than the financial world, but yes, there are some similarities. So first off, we need to talk about the difference between cognitive biases and algorithmic biases. So basically today, when you have to make a decision, so in our case, it's recruiting decision, right? I want to choose candidate A or candidate B. In the fintech world, it could be the decision on who to give a loan to, for instance, right? But both in recruiting and in fintech, you will have decisions to make on your final client or consumer. The thing is that, as I said, in recruiting, there is a lot of cognitive biases, right? So you see someone and you make your decision based on your first impression, and that may lead to a wrong decision because you're biased. That also happens in financial decision, right? So when financial officer decides who to give a loan to, if he's an individual and he decides who to give a loan to, his cognitive biases will influence that decision. So now what we all know is that instead of letting humans decide, we can take it to an artificial intelligence algorithm and then hope for that artificial intelligence to be less biased than us. That's partially true because the good thing with computers is that they don't have a political agenda. So they're not trying to favor one person over another person. They don't have their personal history that will influence their decision, right? Because they're computers. But the problem with computers is that they also show algorithmic biases. So algorithmic biases, a good example of that is, for instance, there were algorithms in the States that were used to decide who to give credits, who to give loans to in the States. The algorithm takes into account all sorts of variables about who is the best candidate for a loan. Among the variables, one of them they took into account was the neighborhood in which the person lives. The problem of taking that into account is that you end up giving less loans to people who are in impoverished areas, regardless of whether that person will be good at reimbursing their loans or not. So the problem, and that happens in the States, it doesn't happen so much in France because we have different rules about the use of data. But the problem we have here is that the algorithm has learned on data that are themselves biased, right? So if I give another example, this is something that happened at Amazon, where they were deciding based on an AI who to promote. This AI has learned based on the history of promotion at Amazon. Because the history of promotion at Amazon, that was made by humans who were themselves biased, and they so happen to promote men more than women, the algorithm that's learning on the historical data is going to reproduce the same bias, right? So that kind of balance between where we should use humans to take decisions and where we should use computer, that happens in recruiting, it happens in finance, it happens in making provisions about who's going to commit crime, it happens in healthcare, and we have to be really careful about using the humans where they're good at and using the computers where they're good at. And often the best way to use it is to do a combination. So have algorithms that help humans take decisions. And I'll give you statistics about that. So today, when doctors look at X-ray for cancer, they scan for cancer, their error rate is about 18%. When an algorithm looks at X-ray for cancer, their error rate is 25%. When you combine both, so a doctor using an AI to define whether there's cancer or not in an image, the error rate drops down to 3.4%. That's because the human has different biases than the computer. So when you combine both, you can end up having better results. And that's something that I think we should do in recruiting. That's what I do, but also in fintech. I think that would be a good approach.
No, thank you. That's an interesting statistics. So combining both, how do you see that work? If we stick to that loan or credit example, do we need like to remove some of the data that we usually use in the credit decisioning process? Like you mentioned, neighborhood. It's one of the very basic parameters. Of course, everything quite obvious, like ethnic origins and then you would have also out of that updated algorithm that is based on a subset of data, we would complement that with a human factor as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I think talking about the technical aspect about how you unbias AI, it's a really complicated question. And in fact, people at Microsoft are working on it, Facebook, everybody's working on how to make algorithmic decisions less biased. The problem is that very often what happens when you remove factors from the algorithm, let's say, for instance, if we remove the geographic location of the person who's applying for a loan, the risk is that you're just reducing the precision of the algorithm. You're basically just making it not as good, right? So there are like technical ways to unbiased algorithms that I think go beyond the discussion we have here because it's like super technical. But one thing that I can talk about, because this is more in my area, is what are humans good at and what are computers good at? So if you compare human intelligence and artificial intelligence, we know that artificial intelligence and algorithms are super precise, they're very fast, and they're very accurate. So if you give them a task to do, they're going to do it precisely, very fast, and accurately. But the problem with AI is that it's super greedy, both in terms of energy, right? So for instance, we know that Google DeepMind is a thing that Google bought recently. In order to play Go, the game of Go, it uses 440 kilowatt per hour, whereas a human will use 20 kilowatt per hour, right? So humans, because we have all these cognitive biases that sometimes are bad, but sometimes are good, we can take decisions in a very frugal way. We don't need that much energy. The other thing is that we don't need that much data either, right? So in order for an algorithm to recognize a cat, it's going to need 1 million images of cats, whereas for a human child to recognize a cat, it's going to have to see like 5 cats, and it will know what a cat is, right? The other thing is there are also differences in terms of creativity, right? So there is creativity. There's like humans are good at divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is when there is one problem and there's lots of possible solutions, but we don't know which one is the best. But we have to like think about a lot of different solutions. Humans are very good at that. And computers are good at convergent thinking, where there is for one problem, there's one specific solution. So I think what's important is to know in a task that you have to make, in a decision you have to make, is make sure that the humans are used on the most complex aspects of the task. So for instance, if we need to decide what are the elements to be taken into account for the algorithm that will decide who to give a loan to, humans have to be the ones to take decisions regarding which elements, which data we should put in the algorithm. We should not delegate that responsibility to developers. This should be a responsibility that's taken by people who have an expertise in the data, right? So sociologists, psychologists, politicians, and then these people can work together with data scientists to make sure that the right data is taken into account when we code the algorithm. But the idea of letting data scientists and experts in AI find the right data to take the right decision, that's a dream. That's not true. AI is not magic. AI is just a tool. So my recommendation is always to have human experts that can help data scientists conceive the best algorithm. And the other point, obviously, that goes hand in hand with that is that you also need diversity at the stage of conception of the algorithm, right? If you only have 25-year-old developers coding the algorithms, they have only one way to think. So they're going to think, oh, okay, well, I'm going to take this data here and here and here, these databases, and it's going to be fine. But most of the time it's not, right? Like in order for an algorithm to take decisions that are good for humanity, you need to have a representation of humanity in the people who have coded the algorithm.
No, thank you. These are two very good advices. So combining skills from data scientists or developers, technical experts in one hand with subject matter experts, and also making sure that the teams that are building the solutions are diverse. Any other tips that you'd like to share with our hackers and hackathon participants to make sure that they avoid bias in general as they build their hackathon prototypes?
So I think there is, so one thing is to really care about the topic you have in front of you. I've worked with data scientists in my company who only relied on technique to find like to write their code. So they were like, oh, I can download this package because it does X, and this package because it does Y, and if I put them together, magic will happen and my algorithm will be fine and unbiased. So again, that's not true. I mean, it's kind of the same point as earlier, is you need to care about what is the technology you're creating, who are you creating it for, and what are your goals with this technology. And if you think about ethics beforehand, so privacy, fairness, you have to embed it in the technology by design and at the very beginning of the tool. This is kind of like, there's been a lot of criticism of artificial intelligence these past years, but that's because it's kind of, we are at the beginning of what artificial intelligence can do. So of course there's going to be lots of criticisms, there's going to be lots of mistakes. But now that the state of the art is maturing, I think it's everyone's responsibility when you develop an algorithm to actually care about what this algorithm is going to do. Who is it going to be used by? What are the limitations of your algorithm, right? Like when people use it, for instance, to decide on a candidate for a loan, maybe your algorithm works in a specific demographic, but it doesn't work everywhere, right? So what are the limitations for that? So those are, I guess, two things: is having really caring about what the impact of your algorithm, and having experts help you in designing the algorithm.
Oh, thank you. Very good advices. We've got one question from Vishal about the diversity that we have in culture, depending on the geography we are at, and the different culture that we have. So leading us to take different financial decisions. for instance, Western world, as he mentioned, are historically considered more liberal when it comes to spending, whereas Eastern world are a bit more conservative. And the question he has is actually, how do we cater to this diversity and yet create a universal model? And maybe do we need a universal model?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, I mean, not everybody will agree on that, but I think it's not a good idea to look for universal solutions to every problem. And I think it's been actually one big problem with our societies in the past 50 years is that we've been looking for unique solutions to all problems and global solutions to all problems. And I think, I mean, we know the impact it has on the environment. We know the impact it has on societies and the dismantlement of the sense of community. So I think ideally it would be, personally, I think it's a good idea to respect local specificities and see why is this specificity valuable, right? So I'm thinking, for instance, about the 2008 financial crisis, where the banks from traditionally Judeo, like Christian countries, have collapsed, and banks from Muslim countries have not collapsed, because the way speculation is seen in Islamic countries is, less liberal, and like speculation is not a good thing, right? So a lot of banks from Islamic countries have survived the crisis much better. I think if we had looked for a global way to handle finances before the crisis, we may have imposed the American financial system to everybody, and then all the banks would have collapsed. So I think that's a good example where the fact that we have differences is very valuable. And uh, like, I care about diversity in recruiting, but that's because I care about diversity in general. I think what makes humanity resilient is the fact that we don't all have the same point of view. So how do you make it work that you respect the point of views that you can see in different regions and still work together with a common goal, right? That, I think, for me, that's our challenge for the future, is how do we respect specificities that give so much richness to humanity and yet manage to work together?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important point. Diversity is also about diversity of opinions, and yeah, having universal models or universal solutions might not be the best option to take there. We have another question from Kaiser, more actually about sustainability principles and how important it is to include them as well as we build innovations and solutions. I don't know if you'd like to take that question as well.
I don't think I understand the question. What?
So yeah, what Kaiser is asking about is actually about sustainability. We've been speaking about diversity, inclusion. What about sustainability? Is it also something important to include here? I don't know if you have any specific. The answer is obviously yes. Sustainability is also important, but
Yes.
how do you have any specific view on that? Maybe also in terms of the way we manage biases, on how this should be handled.
Yeah. So the thing about sustainability is that when I talk about AI and technology and debiasing technology, obviously I'm focusing on biases, cognitive biases, and algorithmic biases. But when we think about the ethics of technology, we also have to think about the impact it has on the physical world. And I think one thing that is not maybe talked about enough is the fact that using a lot of technology has an impact on the environment because of the material we're taking to the material we're using to build computers, the fact that we don't recycle computers, the fact that we are using huge data servers that use a lot of energy. So I don't know to what extent that helps for the hackathon, but I know that one thing that I often, one point that I often insist on is that we should be aware of the fact that, yes, we don't have big factories in our cities anymore, so we don't see pollution every day. But the fact that we're using super powerful computers and that we always want to have our videos streaming in like 1 second and everything has to be flawless, flowing very effortlessly, that has an environmental cost. And I think it's going to be another challenge of the ethics of technology in the next years. There's, whether we talk about the consumption of energy, whether we talk about the use of precious material, precious metals, the sustainability aspect is a very, very important point. I don't know to what extent that helps for this hackathon, but I agree with the points that was raised.
No, thank you. That's indeed very important. By the way, for the hackathon, we've got a special prize for the most the solution with the highest environmental impact in a positive way, of course. Kaiser has just added a couple of comments, maybe to clarify also his question a bit more about, and we've mentioned as an example of financial an example in the fintech space, which was more on the credit and lending loan attributions. The other example that he's actually mentioning is about investing. So as we see more and more investors looking at SDG goals to be targeted in addition to making profit, of course. So combining the two, and we see actually lots of innovations happening in that space with all the ESG and socially responsible investment. So,
so about that, I think so one thing I think that's important is that from what I've seen in impact investing. So first of all, I have one of my investor in my company is an impact investor, and it so happens that my husband actually worked in impact investing. So that's why I know this space quite well. One big problem there is for me is that most of the innovations I'm seeing are about how to handle the data, the ESG data, and make the data readily available to investors and to companies. But I haven't seen very good innovation as to the quality of the data, right? So I can give examples on supply chain because I know that better than other topics. But today, I think none of us want to buy clothes that has been made by children, right? None of us want that. But we end up doing it because a lot of factories have or do hire children or use children, right? The innovation I've seen in the ESG and impact investing space is how to collect data faster about which factories use children or not, and how to make this data readily available. I haven't seen a good company today innovating on how to actually run the audit in the factories and actually go there and look whether they're children or not. So I think it's great that we have this structure of impact investing. We know that people want to invest now in positive change, but we also need people who do the actual groundwork of going to see how things are produced, right? And I think that's where there is a big lack today, is how you make sure that the data you're using in ESG tools are actually reliable.
no, thank you. That's a very interesting point, and probably also a good idea for our hackathon participants. Camille, you mentioned something earlier that I found really interesting. So as you were speaking about cognitive biases, you also mentioned how we can possibly use them in order to make better decisions. Can you maybe share with us an example there and how we can possibly use it in the financial decision in general?
Yeah, so sometimes, so the thing with cognitive biases is that when we talk about it, it's to talk about the places where these cognitive biases led us to wrong decisions, right? But I think what we're not aware of is the fact that cognitive biases 90% of the time leads us to the right decisions. The cases where cognitive biases are leading us to the right decisions is usually cases where we have to take decisions really, 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 really fast, and where we don't have the time to balance the pros and cons and get all the information, etc. So most of these will be like, life-threatening decisions, or whether I should cross the street, or I don't know, like whether I'm going to burn my hand if I touch a super hot pan. So I don't have examples where I could tell you, here you could explicitly use cognitive biases to take better decisions, because by definition, when you're gonna have to take an explicit decision, like where should I go to college, or should I give a loan to that person, these decisions by definition are not automatic. They're thought through decisions, and in these cases, cognitive biases usually push you to the wrong decision, always in the same direction. So in these cases, it's better for you to be aware that you have cognitive biases, and how to make explicit decisions better and reduce the influence of cognitive biases is to first have an explicit and objective way to take decisions. So in the case of recruiting, the point is to know exactly what you are looking for in a candidate before seeing the candidate, right? So most of the time, it's important, before you start taking your decision, it's important that you're defining what are the key elements that you need to collect in order to take your decision, and what's your process for taking that decision. And only after you've done that, you can put yourself in that decision with these explicit objectives written down. So that's one way to make the decision better. The other way to make decisions better is to what we call collective intelligence. So making sure that you have other people's opinion on the decision, and that these other people that you're talking to are really different from you, right? So if they are the same history, same background, same school, they're going to probably take the same decision as you. So there's two things. One is make decisions explicit and make the criteria of your decision explicit. And two is use collective intelligence.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. One last question about the hackathon. And as I mentioned, you are one of our judges there. What do you want to see as one of the innovations coming out of the hackathon, or what would make to you really the best project, or the winning project?
So I think just as I said, for taking decisions, it's important to decide in advance what I'm going to look for before seeing the projects. But I think one thing that matters to me in projects is that we need to know that the project holder is that he, she, or they are really passionate about the topic. The reason I'm saying that is because when you launch a project, what matters is not so much the idea, because there's tons of good ideas out there. What matters is how that good idea is going to be executed. And as you start executing your project, problems will arise that you have not anticipated. And what will make you resilient to these problems is the passion you put in your project. And for me, the number one thing that shows passion is if you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? Like if I don't know, if your idea is to reduce pollution, is there a specific area that is particularly relevant to you, either because you have an expertise or because it's something in your history, in your past, that makes it particularly relevant to you? And this, to me, is more important than the project itself, because the project itself, once you're passionate about it, you will definitely, I think you'll always find solutions and resources.
No, thank you. That's very good advice. So be passionate about what you're doing. Clearly define what you're working on. Make sure that you're making an impact, or define what impact you'd like to have with your project. That sounds like a very good advice. And from what we've seen from previous hackathons, these are definitely the best projects and the winners. They all have an impact, and they all are passionate about their projects. Camille, thank you so much for this very insightful session today. We've learned a lot. I've learned a lot. I'm sure the audience as well. There's definitely lots of efforts to be done to drive more equality, inclusion, fairness in the financial services space, and we can definitely play a key role there. So I'd like to invite everyone watching this to go and check the hackathon website, take part in this hackathon and see how they can help redefine finance for good.
Thank you,
I'd
Shirin, and thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you all. Please join us on the 5th of November also for our next session, which will be about why should everybody hack. We'll have several hackers there, some serial hackathon winners and some others, not very typical hackers. So they will all be joining to share their experience. Thanks again, Camille. That was a very insightful session. We're really delighted to have you today, and thanks to all of our audience. Thank you for the questions, and speak to you all soon. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. Have a good
Bye.
day.